Mrs. Mooney was a butcher's daughter. She was a woman who could keep things to herself, a determined woman. She married her father's worker and opened a butcher's shop near Spring Gardens. But when her father died, Mr. Mooney started to behave very badly. He drank too much, stole money from the cash register, and got deeply into debt. It didn't help to make him promise to stop. He always went back to his bad habits after a few days. By fighting with his wife in front of customers and buying bad meat, he ruined their business. One night, he even tried to hurt his wife with a big knife, so she had to sleep at a neighbor's house. After that, they lived apart. Mrs. Mooney went to the priest and got permission to separate from him, taking care of the children. She didn't give him any money, food, or a place to stay, so he had to find a job as a sheriff's helper. He was a small, shabby drunk man with a white face and a white mustache. He sat in the bailiff's office all day, waiting for work. Mrs. Mooney took whatever money she had left from the butcher shop and started a boarding house on Hardwick Street. She was a big, strong woman who knew how to manage things well. Her boarders included tourists from Liverpool and the Isle of Man and sometimes entertainers from the music halls. Most of the residents were clerks from the city. They all respected Mrs. Mooney and called her the Madam. Mrs. Mooney's boarders paid 15 shillings a week for food and a place to stay, but beer or stout at dinner wasn't included. They had similar interests and jobs, so they were very friendly with each other. They often talked about their favorite things and people. Jack Mooney, Mrs. Mooney's son, worked as a clerk in Fleet Street. He was known for being a tough guy. He liked to use rough language and often came home late at night. When he met his friends, he always had a funny story to tell and knew about good opportunities, like a good horse or a talented performer. He was also good at boxing and singing funny songs. On Sunday nights, there would be a gathering in Mrs. Mooney's living room. The entertainers from the music halls would perform, and a musician named Sheridan played music. Polly Mooney, Mrs. Mooney's daughter, also sang a song. I'm a naughty girl. You needn't pretend. You know I am. Polly was a slim 19-year-old girl with light soft hair and a small, full mouth. Her eyes were gray with a hint of green, and they tended to look upward when she spoke to someone, making her seem like a little mischievous angel. Mrs. Mooney first sent Polly to work as a typist in an office, but since a disreputable sheriff's helper used to come to the office every other day to talk to her, Mrs. Mooney brought her daughter back home and made her do housework instead. Polly was very lively, and Mrs. Mooney wanted her to have fun with the young men who lived there. Besides, young men liked knowing that there was a young woman nearby. Polly flirted with the young men, but Mrs. Mooney knew they were just having fun and not serious about her daughter. Things went on like this for a while, but then Mrs. Mooney noticed that something was going on between Polly and one of the young men. She watched them closely but didn't say anything. Polly knew her mother was watching, but Mrs. Mooney didn't say anything. People in the house started talking about Polly and the young man, but Mrs. Mooney stayed silent. Polly started acting strangely, and the young man seemed worried. Finally, when Mrs. Mooney thought it was the right time, she intervened. She handled the situation decisively, like cutting through meat with a cleaver, and she had made up her mind about what to do. It was a sunny Sunday morning in early summer, promising warmth, but with a cool breeze blowing. All the windows of the boarding house were open, and the lace curtains gently billowed towards the street. The bells of George's church rang out continuously, and worshippers walked to the church, some alone and some in groups, holding small books in their gloved hands. Breakfast was finished in the boarding house, and the table in the breakfast room was covered with plates holding streaks of yellow eggs with bits of bacon fat and bacon rind. Mrs. Mooney sat in a straw armchair and watched as the servant Mary cleared away the breakfast things. She instructed Mary to gather the crusts and broken bread to use for Tuesday's bread pudding. When the table was cleared and everything put away, Mrs. Mooney began to think about the conversation she had with Polly the night before. It confirmed her suspicions. She had asked frank questions, and Polly had given frank answers. Both of them felt a bit awkward, though. Mrs. Mooney felt awkward because she didn't want to seem too casual about the news or appear to have agreed to it. Polly felt awkward because she didn't want people to think she knew what her mother was planning. Mrs. Mooney looked at the small clock on the mantelpiece when she realized that the church bells had stopped ringing. It was 17 minutes past 11. She had plenty of time to talk to Mr. Doran and still make it to Marlborough Street by 12 o'clock. She was confident she would succeed. After all, she had the support of social opinion on her side. She was a mother who had been wronged. She had let Mr. Doran live in her house, thinking he was honorable, but he had taken advantage of Polly's youth and inexperience. The question was, what would he do to make things right? There had to be consequences in such situations. It's easy for the man to walk away like nothing happened, but the girl has to deal with the consequences. Some mothers might accept money to keep quiet about it, but Mrs. Mooney wouldn't do that. For her, the only way to make up for her daughter's honor was marriage. Mrs. Mooney thought through her plan again before sending Mary up to Mr. Doran's room to tell him she wanted to talk to him. She was confident she would win. Mr. Doran was a serious young man, not like the others who were loud and reckless. If it had been someone else, like Mr. Sheridan or Mr. Meade or Bandham Lyons, it would have been harder for her. She didn't think Mr. Doran would want the scandal of the affair to become public. All the people in the boarding house knew about it, and some had even made up stories. Besides, Mr. Doran had been working at a Catholic wine merchant's office for 13 years, and if the scandal got out, he might lose his job. But if he agreed to marry Polly, everything might turn out okay. Mrs. Mooney knew he had a good job and probably some money saved up. It was almost 11:30. Mrs. Mooney stood up and looked at herself in the mirror. She was satisfied with the determined expression on her face and thought about other mothers who couldn't control their daughters. Mr. Doran was very worried this Sunday morning. He had tried to shave twice, but his hand was shaking so much that he had to stop. His face was covered in a reddish beard, and every few minutes, his glasses fogged up, so he had to take them off and wipe them with his handkerchief. Thinking about the confession he had made the night before made him feel terrible. The priest had asked him so many questions about the affair, and in the end, he had made it sound even worse than it was. He felt relieved that he might have a chance to make things right. But what could he do now? He couldn't ignore it. People would talk, and his boss would find out. Dublin was a small place, and everyone knew each other's business. He felt a warm feeling in his chest as he imagined his boss calling for him. All those years of hard work seemed wasted now. He used to be wild when he was younger, boasting about not believing in God and arguing with his friends at the pub. But that was in the past, almost. He still bought a newspaper every week, but also went to church regularly and lived a quiet life most of the time. He had enough money to settle down, but that wasn't the problem. He was worried about what his family would think. Polly's father wasn't well respected, and her mother's boarding house was getting a bad reputation. He felt like he was being tricked. He could imagine his friends laughing and talking about the affair. Polly sometimes used bad grammar, but what did that matter if he loved her? He couldn't decide whether to like her or be disappointed in her for what she had done. After all, he was involved too. His instinct told him to stay single, not to get married. Once you're married, there's no turning back, it said. While he sat helplessly on the side of the bed in his shirt and trousers, she gently knocked on his door and came in. She told him everything, that she had confessed to her mother and that her mother wanted to talk to him that morning. She cried and hugged him, saying, "Oh, Bob, Bob, what am I to do? What am I to do at all?" She even said she would end her life. He comforted her weakly, telling her not to cry, that everything would be okay, and she shouldn't worry. He felt the agitation of her bosom against his shirt. It wasn't entirely his fault that it happened. He remembered well the first casual touches of her dress, her breath, and her fingers. Then, late one night, as he was getting ready for bed, she timidly knocked on his door. She wanted to relight her candle since hers had blown out. It was her bath night. She wore a loose jacket made of soft flannel. Her white foot shone in her furry slippers, and her skin was warm and perfumed. A faint scent rose from her hands and wrists as she lit the candle. On nights when he came home very late, she would warm up his dinner. He hardly paid attention to what he was eating, feeling her presence beside him in the quiet house at night. And how thoughtful she was. If the night was cold or wet or windy, there was always a little glass of punch waiting for him. Maybe they could be happy together. They used to go upstairs together quietly, each holding a candle, and on the third floor, they would exchange reluctant goodnights. They used to kiss. He remembered her eyes, the touch of her hand, and his excitement. But excitement fades. He repeated her question, asking himself, "What am I to do?" The instinct of the unmarried warned him to be cautious. But the sin was there. Even his sense of honor told him that he had to make amends for such a sin. While he was sitting with her on the side of the bed, Mary came to the door and said that Mrs. Mooney wanted to see him in the parlor. He stood up to put on his coat and waistcoat, feeling more helpless than ever. When he was dressed, he went over to her to comfort her. Everything would be okay, he assured her. He left her crying on the bed, softly moaning, "Oh my God." As he went down the stairs, his glasses fogged up so much that he had to take them off and wipe them. He wished he could fly away to another country where he would never have to hear about his troubles again. But something pushed him downstairs, step by step. The stern faces of his employer and Mrs. Mooney stared at him, making him feel even more uncomfortable. On the last flight of stairs, he passed Jack Mooney, who was coming up from the pantry with 2 bottles of base. They nodded coldly at each other, and for a moment, the lover's eyes met Jack's thick, bulldog-like face and his muscular arms. When he reached the foot of the staircase, he glanced up and saw Jack watching him from the door of the return room. Suddenly, he remembered the night when one of the music hall performers, a blonde Londoner, had made a suggestive comment about Polly. The reunion had almost turned violent because of Jack. Everyone tried to calm him down, but Jack kept shouting that if anyone tried to mess with his sister, he'd teach them a lesson. Polly sat on the side of the bed, crying for a while. Then she dried her eyes and went to the mirror. She dipped the towel in the water jug and refreshed her eyes with the cool water. She looked at herself in the mirror and adjusted a hairpin above her ear. Then she returned to the bed and sat at the foot. She stared at the pillows for a long time, reminiscing about pleasant memories. She rested her neck against the cool iron bed rail and drifted into a daydream. There was no sign of worry on her face anymore. She waited patiently, almost cheerfully, without any fear, as her memories slowly gave way to hopes and dreams of the future. Her hopes and dreams were so detailed that she didn't even notice the pillows she was staring at or remember why she was waiting. Finally, she heard her mother calling. She jumped up and ran to the banister. "Polly, Polly." "Yes, Mama." "Come down, dear. Mr. Doran wants to speak to you." Then she remembered what she had been waiting for.